Today on Richard Should Just Go Ahead and Get Takeaway, I'm making myself a pizza. Step one is to grab the container of all of the random packets I have from the refrigerator and look for things that look like yeast. So as I dig around, we'll see some red pepper and some Parmesan. Those don't count. Instead, we'll pick out the 2 yeast packets from when I used to do home brewing, both of which expired years ago, 5 or 8 years ago, respectively. Now, part of the motivation today is to do an experiment where I treat this wine yeast as a starter for future pizzas and potentially breads. Now, it's not going to be a sourdough starter. They'll have maybe a little bit more flavor because they're designed for fruity applications, but it will also allow me to just keep them living, and so I don't have to keep going and finding the auto-rise baker's yeast. So we'll throw a packet in with some warm water, a tablespoon of sugar just to get it kicked off right, and then some uh, all-purpose flour. To get the yeast running, I set the jar next to my computer while it mined some Bitcoin for me, and the extra temperature really helped them get started, and that yeast is still alive here weeks later. Back in the kitchen for the main event, I'm using my food processor to do the dough mixing and kneading. Now, in place of a yeast packet, I'm using a dollop of the yeast paste that I just made. It will take a little bit longer to rise, but it worked out just fine. The recipe for dough that I use is approximately 60 to 65% hydration. I use 400 grams of flour to 250 grams of water, and I specifically use a high proof flour, or I think it's called Power Flour. It's a local blend that has an increased gluten content that gives a little bit more chewy texture to the bread. If I had wheat, I would add maybe 20% of whole wheat flour, but today I don't have it. With everything added to the food processor, I throw the food processor on high, and while it's running, add about 20 grams of olive oil. Really, I'm just trying to get the entire dough ball oiled and allow the food processor to run a little bit. The food processor is going to work hard on this. And I let that run on hard for as long as it will go, because this food processor has an automatic shutoff when it gets too hot, which turns out is directly comparable to when the dough is needed. Now, while I think that's still good advice, since I made this video, I've actually broken the food processor. Not doing, well, it was doing dough, but it wasn't from overheating. It was immediately shut down because I used too much flour. So here's a disclaimer that the recipe I used here with 400 grams of flour was fine, but when I tried to kick it up to 500, the food processor just immediately stalled, would not turn, and has not turned since. And I still haven't figured out why. It doesn't smell. It just shut down. I can't find any blown fuses. Well, there are no fuses in it. It's a cheap model. So there's your disclaimer. You can also knead by hand if you need to. Even with the food processor, I still knead by hand for a few minutes. It's good exercise. But once I'm satisfied with the consistency of the dough, I roll it a little bit, split it in half with a dough scraper, and then put the 2 dough balls into separate containers. The large Gladware or Kroger brand containers sprayed down with cooking spray are an excellent place to let dough rise. And so one of these is going in the refrigerator, and the other is actually going in front of my computer because I want to make pizza tonight. Now, after letting the dough ferment, this is actually the second day batch. The first day I struggled with, learned that you really need to keep it covered because it will dry out if you don't. And it has today's batch has these lovely bubbles that are delicious to pup. Delicious, wrong word. I'm going to turn the dough out onto my silicone baking sheet. It's totally optional, but it is a nice addition that allows me to get away without flouring my work surface. And I'm going to use the technique of pressing into the dough in order to do a rough approximation of the size, and then try to spread it out with the like gravity method where you hold the dough and it stretches. I've also used a rolling pin in the past successfully. I find it a little bit easier, and if you watch pizza making videos, the stretching the dough is more authentic. So I'm trying to learn that, but there's no shame in using a rolling pin. Once I'm satisfied with the size of the pizza or I get tired of stretching it, I bring over a pizza screen. A pizza screen is an aluminum grid that professional pizzerias use for the conveyor belt style pizzas. Not quite authentic like Neapolitan, but I like the texture that it provides. Now, an important component of this is greasing the pizza screen sufficiently before putting the dough on, or else it's going to stick and be totally messy and terrible. And this is actually some major learning for myself, is that you're not supposed to run the pizza screen through the dishwasher, just kind of brush it off to get off any crust and keep using that seasoned, I suppose, pizza screen without washing, and the pizza shouldn't stick. The day before, with the other half of the dough, I actually had turned it into a calzone because it was sticking so much. And it kind of recovered, but it still stuck to the screen. Back to the pizza at hand, I'm doing a classic traditional style pizza with sauce on the bottom. This sauce, it's mediocre. I actually got it out of a can from the restaurant supply store. I would suggest buying premium pizza sauce whenever possible, or make your own, but I don't know how yet. Um, this dough is actually relatively greasy because of how much I sprayed down the plastic container, although normally at this step I also brush the crust with olive oil because olive oil makes everything delicious. In order to make the pizza an authentic Italian dish, add Italian seasoning, plus oregano is delicious. And then I move on to cheese. I have no shame and use the shredded pizza blend from the restaurant supply store. If you want to be more authentic, actually slice real mozzarella. I think it's a waste of time. For toppings, I'm going with a vegetarian pizza, largely because I haven't gone to the store and bought more bacon. Pretty much all the sliced ingredients I ran through my food processor because I love it, and I'm crying now that I broke my food processor today. Red peppers, onions, olives, and I even include frozen mushrooms. Um, since I'm perfectly fine with eating frozen pizzas, I'm also perfectly fine with using frozen pizza toppings. I'll freeze the black olives that I have extra, just drain the brine so that the water isn't in the way. And then mushrooms will go in the freezer. They're disgusting if you let them thaw, but if you put them on the pizza frozen, they will cook just fine along with all the other ingredients. Now, while I've been doing all this pizza work and even before, the oven has been preheating to 550 degrees. I even keep two uh, thermal bricks, the same stuff you would build a pizza oven out of, in there to try to act as a thermal battery and keep the temperature a little bit more even. I'm going to cook this for about 7, maybe 8 minutes until pulling out the pizza. And honestly, typically I just smell it and then I pull it out. But that's prone to burning too. Give the pizza about 5 minutes to cool off on the oven, and then you can cut it up. Don't slice directly on your silicone baking sheet. It is not a cutting board. However, the dollar store thin cutting boards are excellent for using as a pizza scraper. Get under there, pull off the pie, and this is where you discover if you didn't grease your pizza screen sufficiently. And here I did, so it turned out well. Overall, this pizza was a pizza. I'm not pretending to be an expert. I think it's tasty. I think the sauce needs some improvement. The dough was kind of bland, actually. So the fact that I used the wine yeast, it's still going strong 2 weeks later, but it doesn't have any unique, for example, um, sourdough flavor. Really, if you get any takeaway from my videos, it's that I'm wasting my time and you should just go spend 20 bucks on a pizza from, your local delivery place, support your businesses, and it'll probably taste better than whatever the hell you can make at home. Isn't that depressing? You're welcome.